This is ridiculous, just mail him a bus pass. Could one dropped photo change everything? The voice came from somewhere in the back of the DMV line. He was old, slow, struggling to hold his cane in one hand and his trembling wallet in the other. No one offered to help, no one even looked up until his wallet slipped from his fingers and a folded photo tumbled out, black and white, edges worn with time. 4 Marines. One carried the other through smoke and fire, and that's when the room fell completely silent because someone recognized the photo and the man who never asked to be seen was finally seen. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning air in Des Moines was colder than usual. Gray skies stretched low over the city and in front of the downtown DMV, the light already wrapped halfway around the building. It was just past 8 a.m. inside. The waiting area was crammed tight with bundled coats, foggy glasses, and the faint sound of number announcements over the loudspeaker. People shifted from foot to foot, clutching paperwork and IDs. No one made small talk. This wasn't a place for patients, not today. At window 6, an elderly man stood quietly, his cane resting lightly against the counter. He wore a worn olive-green jacket, military style with fading threads around the cuffs. A navy knit cap covered his thinning white hair. His mask, gray and slightly loose at the edges, covered his mouth, but not the ears carved deep into his face. His name was George Langley, 80 years old, former United States Marine. He walked with a limp, left leg slightly bowed, a quiet stiffness in the knee. Old injury, Vietnam, but you'd never hear that from him. He never told people about Hughes City, not even his neighbors. Today, he'd come to renew his driver's license. He still drove himself to the pharmacy once a week and sometimes early in the morning to the cemetery. He never liked asking for help. As he leaned forward at the counter, the young woman behind the glass repeated herself, this time a little louder. Sir, I need your current license and your 2 forms of ID. Do you have them ready? George nodded slowly, reaching into his coat pocket with one hand, the other gripping the edge of the counter for balance. His fingers fumbled along the lining. Behind him, someone shifted impatiently. A cough, a muttered sigh. George pulled out a thin leather wallet, brown, creased, and barely held together at the corners. He opened it carefully, but his hands were shaking, not from nervousness, but from time. It took a moment longer than usual. A man in his 30s, standing 3 people back, exhaled sharply and rolled his eyes. This is ridiculous, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Just mail him a bus pass and move on. A few chuckled behind their masks. George didn't react. He didn't turn around. He just looked down, thumbing through the cards inside the wallet, trying to find the right one. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled at a folded paper tucked deep in the pocket. Then something slipped loose. It fluttered from the wallet, light as air, and drifted to the ground between his boots. A photograph, black and white, old. The woman behind the counter noticed it first. Her voice softened, confused. Sir, you dropped something? George blinked. He looked down and saw the picture face up on the tile floor. He bent slowly, one hand on the counter, and reached down with effort. But someone else stepped forward. Could this photo reveal a hidden hero? From the far side of the room, a man in a staff badge and black fleece had begun walking over. He'd been passing by when the raised voices caught his attention. The photo was just lying there under the harsh DMV lighting, as out of place as a piece of history on a linoleum floor. The man knelt down and picked it up. He stared at it for a beat longer than expected. It was a picture taken decades ago. 4 young Marines standing side by side in front of a bombed-out building. Hughes City, 1968. The Tet Offensive. George was in the photo, thinner, darker-haired, with the same serious eyes. One of the others was a man from Iowa, a young private, barely 19 at the time. He had a crooked grin and a helmet slanted back on his head. The staff member's face changed slowly, subtly. His name was David Thompson, and the young man grinning beside George in that photo was his father. David blinked, unsure if what he was seeing could be real. He had that photo at home, framed in wood, sitting on the hallway shelf near his family service medals, but his copy had been blackened slightly at one corner. His dad had spilled coffee on it years ago. This one was untouched, still crisp along the edges. He looked up at the old man in front of him, then back at the photo. Sir, he said quietly, his voice lowering, are you George Langley? The room didn't notice at first. Too many people were staring at their phones, mumbling under breath, tapping their feet, but something in the air shifted. George hesitated, unsure how to answer, then gave a small nod. David's hands trembled. My father, he said, James Thompson, he served with you and Hugh, didn't he? George's eyes flickered. Jimmy, his voice was hoarse. He hadn't said the name out loud in years. The memory hit him harder than he expected. A rooftop, a sniper's line of sight, 3 men bleeding, and one final sprint with Jimmy over his shoulder through a storm of glass and smoke. He always said, David continued, voice tight, that someone carried him out. Said he never saw your face, just remembered the voice. You were 28 and you never even told him your last name. George said nothing. He was still looking at the photo. A ghost of a smile passed through his eyes. From the back of the line, The impatient man tried to chime in again, but this time, someone shushed him. A quiet ripple spread through the waiting room. People were starting to realize something was happening. Could this moment transform the entire room? David turned toward the crowd, not with anger, but with something deeper, reverence. He handed the photo back to George, still kneeling, then stood slowly. David Thompson hadn't planned to stop at window 6, he was just walking past, clipboard in hand, checking in on staffing for the afternoon shift. Mondays were always chaotic, but today, it felt worse. The winter cold, the backlog of appointments, and too many people who just didn't want to be there. He'd caught the raised voices before he saw the source, the impatient man muttering about a bus pass, the DMV clerk stalling awkwardly, unsure how to handle the tension, and then he saw it, a piece of history lying face up on the floor, something delicate and quiet right in the middle of all that noise. David stepped forward instinctively. He bent down to pick it up, brushing the corner gently as he lifted it off the tile. It was a photograph, faded but clear, 4 men in uniform standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a crumbling wall, likely a bombed-out school or command post. No smiles, just young, serious faces, sunlight casting sharp shadows across dust-covered helmets, and one of those faces, David stopped breathing for a moment. The second man from the right, hands clasped behind his back, chin slightly tilted, was his father, James Thompson. David had grown up with that face in every room of their house. There was a framed copy of this very photo hanging in his family's hallway right above the folded flag, and just below the medals his dad never liked to talk about. He stared at the man beside him in the picture, shorter than the rest, a square jaw, olive skin tone tan dark from the heat, holding a rifle low across his chest. The name had never been written on the back, but his father always said, "That's the man who saved me." I never knew his full name, just George. David's throat tightened. He looked up. The man standing at the counter now had deeper lines in his face and his back curved forward with age, but the eyes, they were the same, calm, sharp, watching the room without needing to speak. David held the photo in both hands and took a slow step forward. "Sir," he said, his voice low, almost unsure. "It would come out right. Are you George Langley?" The old man's eyebrows rose slightly. David felt a ripple move through the room. "Did you fight in Hughes City in 1968? The moment stretched thin. Even the clerk behind the glass froze, one hand still hovering above the keyboard. George blinked, a pause, then a small nod. David turned the photo slightly, showing it to him. "You carried my father out. You were the one. He told me someone ran across open ground and dragged him back after the ambush." George didn't answer right away, but his lips parted slowly. His voice came out gravelly and soft. "Jimmy from Council Bluffs. He was hit near the church." "I remember." David stared. He hadn't heard his father's hometown from a stranger's mouth in decades. The way George said it, flat and unceremonious, like he was stating something that had happened just last week. The impatient man from earlier stepped back, looking down now. Even the teenagers in line stopped scrolling their phones. The silence in the DMV was eerie but not uncomfortable. It was reverent. David turned slightly to face the waiting room. His voice stayed quiet, but it carried it. "This man," he said, holding the photo gently in one hand, "saved my father's life in Vietnam." No one spoke. The buzz of the fluorescent lights hummed above them. Outside, snowflakes had started falling again. He turned back to George. "I've had this picture hanging in my house since I was 8. My dad never forgot that day. He said there was smoke everywhere and he thought he was dead until someone grabbed him and didn't let go." George shook his head slowly. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said. "I just didn't want to leave anyone behind." David's eyes welled up. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the absurd contrast, this moment here in a place known for frustration and bureaucracy. Maybe it was the quiet steadiness of George's voice, or the photo, now weathered by time, somehow surviving long enough to make it back to the hands of someone who'd needed to see it. He held the photo to his chest gently, then looked up at the clerk. "Please pause his appointment." The clerk nodded, speechless. David looked around the room. "Everyone, just give us a moment." No one objected. David led George away from the counter slowly, not out of disrespect, but because something about it felt too important for red tape. They moved to the edge of the waiting area near the frosted windows. People turned their chairs to watch, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. David offered George a seat. The older man declined it. Of course, he did. Instead, he leaned slightly on his cane, standing tall in the only way he knew how. David took a deep breath. "My dad passed 3 years ago," he said, "but he talked about you until the very end. Said he never got to thank the man who saved him." George looked down at the photo again. "You tell him," he said gently. He made it count. David smiled even as his eyes watered. He took out his phone and scrolled quickly through the gallery, found the photo, held it next to the one George had dropped. The same moment, the same faces, just 2 lives, separated by 5 decades. He stepped back toward the middle of the room. "I want everyone here to understand something," he said. "There's a lot of paperwork in this building, a lot of procedures, but none of that matters if we forget why we're standing here in the first place." He turned to George. "You waited in line without complaint. You were mistreated, spoken over, ignored. But you didn't raise your voice, you didn't flash credentials, you didn't ask for anything." He paused. "You already gave." George didn't answer. He didn't need to. The room stayed Silent, not out of shock, but out of a kind of shared understanding, a slow, steady kind of honor that passed from person to person. David turned to the clerk. "Let's get Mr. Langley processed right now, no more waiting." He reached for the intercom, and for the first time that day, the entire DMV fell still. David Thompson stood still for a moment, the weight of what he was about to do settling on his shoulders. The room wasn't noisy anymore, no tapping shoes, no irritated sighs, no rustling papers. Just quiet, a strange, gentle hush in a place never designed for reverence. He turned toward the clerk behind the desk, who was still holding George Langley's paperwork like it was made of glass. "Stop," David said, his voice firm but calm. "No more processing for now." The clerk blinked, then nodded. David walked to the center of the room. Footsteps soft but deliberate against the tile. He reached for the old PA microphone mounted by the wall, a dusty intercom few people even remembered still worked. With a low buzz, he pressed the button. "I need to say something," his voice echoed gently through the speakers overhead. "Please, everyone, just a moment." A few people looked up from their phones. Some had already put them away, others sat in silence, hands folded, waiting. David glanced around the room, his eyes resting on George, who stood just as quietly as he had 20 minutes ago, his left leg resting into the cane like it always had. David cleared his throat. "The man you see here today, this quiet man who stood in line like everyone else, once carried my father, bleeding, unconscious through enemy fire in Hughes City, 1968 foot." He looked down at the photo in his hand, still warm from his grip. "My father wouldn't have survived that day, and I wouldn't be standing here now if not for George Langley." No one moved, no one interrupted. David took a breath. "So if he takes his time today, I think we all owe him that much." Silence. Then a rustle from the back row. A young mother stood up, her hand resting on her son's shoulder. She gave a single nod, a respectful one, then sat back down. A teenager in a hoodie dropped his eyes to the floor, the same one who'd been muttering earlier. He didn't say a word. Then another sound, a chair being scooted gently to the side. One of the clerks stepped out from behind the glass wall carrying a gray DMV chair with metal legs, not fancy, not important looking, but it was clean and it meant something. David met him halfway and helped carry it over. He placed it down right in front of the main service window, then turned to George. "Please, Mr. Langley, let me help." George looked at the chair, then at David, then the rest of the room. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. His hand tightened slightly on the cane and after a pause, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. David offered an arm for support. George didn't take it, but he nodded, appreciative, still proud, still steady. When he finally sat down, a breath seemed to pass through the room, a collective exhale. David turned to the clerk again. "Let's finish this man's renewal." The young woman behind the desk, maybe 25, maybe 30, had tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. She nodded quickly, typing without a word. For the next 5 minutes, no one made a sound. George answered every question clearly when asked. His voice never wavered, his hands still trembled slightly, but he held his ID in place, looked straight into the camera, and didn't flinch when the flash went off. When the temporary paper license printed, David reached for it, then paused. He turned to George. "Do you still drive often, sir?" George nodded once. "Only for the morning paper and to take my neighbor's dog to the vet sometimes." David smiled. He handed him the form. "Then keep driving, Mr. Langley." George folded the paper carefully, then stood without help and adjusted his coat. From the back, an older man, maybe in his 60s, raised his hand awkwardly. "I served, too," he said. "Numb, 71. I just wanted to say thank you." George nodded again. Then another voice. "My uncle was in Hugh. He never made it back. I think he would have liked knowing this happened here." One by one, little waves of voice, no shouting, no declarations, just quiet acknowledgments like the kind of salute you do with your heart instead of your hand. As George walked slowly toward the exit, David followed beside him. The line of people, once a crowd of strangers, now resembled something closer to a silent procession. No one tried to go next, no one rushed forward. A young man near the door opened it quietly, held it open with both hands, as George stepped out into the cold. The snow had begun to fall again, gentle, not sharp or angry, just soft enough to rest on his beanie without melting too quickly. David stepped out behind him. "Sir," he said, just above a whisper, "what made you keep the photo all these years?" George looked down at his gloved hand where the folded image rested now, half tucked into the crease of his coat. He didn't answer immediately, then without turning, he spoke. "Because the boys in that photo didn't all get to come home, but I did." David nodded slowly. George added, "And I figured if one of their kids ever needed to know, I ought to still be able to show them." The wind blew slightly, then nothing harsh, just enough to tug at his coat collar. Then George Langley walked down the ramp, cane tapping gently against the concrete. He didn't look back, and David watched him until he disappeared around the corner, the soft sound of traffic returning as the world slowly exhaled again. The next morning, David Thompson sat at his kitchen table, still wearing the same jacket he'd worn at the DMV. His laptop sat open in front of him, and next to it, carefully laid flat, was the black and white photo. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about it, so before sunrise with a mug of coffee growing Cold, he wrote something, a post, just a few paragraphs, no hashtags, no emojis, he titled it. He waited his whole life to be seen, then he uploaded the photo. The original George had dropped, and beside it, a second photo he'd taken from home, same four men, same dust-covered boots, same exhausted smiles, half in uniform, half in dirt, and in the middle, the young man holding another man on his shoulder. That was George. David wrote, "Yesterday, I met someone at the DMV, he wasn't loud, he didn't demand anything, he waited in line like everyone else, even though he could barely stand. My name is David Thompson, and 52 years ago, this man carried my father out of a war zone in Hughes City. Without him, my dad wouldn't have survived. Without him, I wouldn't be here at all. His name is George Langley, and he deserves to be seen." He hit post, then he went to bed, not expecting much. By morning, there were 3,200 shares. By lunch, local stations were calling, and by dinner, George Langley's name was trending across Iowa. The following week, two unexpected things happened. First, a handwritten letter arrived at George's door, not typed, not emailed, but real, folded and creased by a man with careful hands. It was signed by Major General Arthur McMillan, retired, and it read, "Dear Mr. Langley, I don't know if you remember me. I was the terrified 19-year-old who froze during the ambush on Loy Street. I couldn't move, I couldn't even speak, but you did. You didn't just carry me, you shielded me, and because of that, I got to grow old, I got to marry, I got to raise daughters, I got to serve 3 more tours. I owe you everything. I never said it then, but I'm saying it now. Thank you, Corporal Langley." George held the letter like it was glass, then he placed it next to the photo, right under the small frame on his mantel where both had always belonged. He didn't like the attention, never had, so when the reporters came, he politely declined. When someone offered to repaint his porch, he thanked them, but said the old wood still held up just fine. But something had changed. Now when he walked down to the corner store, people nodded. When he paused at crosswalks, drivers waved him through. When he sat on the bench outside the library where he liked to read the paper, strangers would sometimes sit beside him just to say hello. One man came up and said, "You don't know me, but my uncle served with someone named Langley. You wouldn't happen to..." George smiled, then shook his head. "Probably not me," he said softly, but he smiled anyway. 2 weeks later, a ceremony was held at the Des Moines Community Library. It wasn't flashy, no red carpet, just a few folding chairs, a podium, and a bronze plaque. David stood in front of a small crowd, clergy, teachers, veterans, parents holding toddlers, and cleared his throat. He gestured to the newly renovated corner of the library where the light from the window hit just right. "This space," he said, "will now be called the Langley Reading Room." He looked to the side. George sat in the front row, wearing a navy sport coat over his old olive green shirt, still with his wooden cane, still with that quiet posture. David continued, "For those who don't know, George Langley never asked to be honored. He never asked for applause, but decades ago, in a narrow street in Hughes City, he made sure 3 young soldiers came home, and yesterday, I finally got to tell him one of those soldiers was my dad." A pause. Somewhere in the back, someone sniffled. David placed a hand on the plaque, "Langley Reading Room, for the quiet heroes." Then he stepped down, and the first person to speak after that was an elderly woman. She didn't give a speech, she just walked up, placed a single white carnation on the podium, and whispered, "He reminds me of my brother." And that was enough. That night, George sat at his kitchen table. He didn't have a laptop or a smartphone, he didn't even know what trending meant, but he had a stack of letters now, and a folded copy of that newspaper article tucked neatly into the Bible he hadn't opened in years. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small aged envelope. Inside was the photo, the same one from Hugh, still slightly curled from time. He turned it over and with a ballpoint pen wrote, "Seen." Finally, then he placed it back. Sometimes people still ask David why he made such a big deal over something small. He always answers the same way: some heroes never ask for anything, but they deserve to be seen, even if it takes 52 years. And in Des Moines, Iowa, in a small corner of a library where sunlight pools at 10:15 every morning, there's a plaque that reminds anyone who reads, quiet doesn't mean forgotten. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.